This video will work through problem 4.3 from Gapenski's Healthcare Finance, 6th edition. Okay, so we're given a chart with, for 4 different organizations, their year-end balances of their balance sheet for 14 and 15, and then revenues and expenses for during 15. So, and we're asked to basically fill in all the empty spots. So we know that, so starting with the top row here, the 14 in data, we know that assets equals liabilities plus equity. So if we know we had 80,000 in assets and 50,000 in liabilities, then we must have had 30,000 in equity, because 30 plus 50 gives us 80. Then here we had 100,000 in assets, 60,000 in equity. Well, what plus 60 gives us 100? That would be 40. Here we have an unknown amount of assets, but we know we have liabilities and equity of 75 and 45. So we know that we must have had 120,000 in assets. And then finally, same as this problem here, 150,000 in assets, 90,000 in equity. We must have had 60,000 in liabilities. So pretty straightforward for that part. Same problem basically for this row as well. If we had 55 and 45 of liabilities and equity, then we must have had 100 in assets. If we have 130 in assets and 62, did I write that right? Yep, 62 in liabilities, then 130 minus 62 gives us 68,000 in equity. Sorry, I had to think about that one because of the 2. Okay, then we have here assets of 180, equity of 110. So therefore, we had to have 70,000 in liabilities, and then finally, liabilities and equity have to equal assets. So that would be 225. So here's where it gets a little trickier, right? Because now they're saying, well, we had, we're giving you either the revenues or the expense, but not both. So how do we get to revenue? Well, if we assume that these firms are all not-for-profit, which the book says they are, right? So these are all not-for-profit. So what do we know about not-for-profits? They are bound by the non-distribution constraint, which means they cannot pay out dividends. So if they have profits, they have to retain those earnings. And if they retain those earnings, that means that the equity will go up by the amount of retained earnings. So what we're going to assume here is that these organizations had no additional equity infusions during the course of 2015, and that all the changes in equity come from retained earnings. So one way we know how much profit they would have then, or net income, is to look at the change in equity over from 14 to 15. So from year-end 14 to year-end 15. So in the case of, was this Pittman, they had 30,000 in equity at the beginning of 2015, or the end of 14, and they ended 2015 with 45. So they had an increase of 15,000 in equity, which means that their net income was 15,000. Well, revenues minus expenses gives us net income, so 330 plus 15 gives us 345. So this Pittman must have had 345,000 in revenue. Next, we look at the change in equity for Rose, and they started with 60, ended with 68, so that means they had 8. So in this case, we know the revenue is 400 and we don't know the expenses, but we know that when you subtract the expenses from the revenue, you wind up with 8. So that means that expenses were 392. With Beckman, we know that their equity went from 45 to 110. That's a change of 65. So 360 plus 65 gives us 425. So we know their revenues must have been 425. Or I should have had a question mark there. And then finally, Jaffe has 500,000 in revenue, but they had a change in equity from 90 to 145. That's an increase of 55. So they must have had 55,000 in net income. 500 minus 445 gives us 55. Okay, so that is 4.3. It's pretty straightforward as long as you remember those two kind of key points. Number one, that assets equal liabilities plus equity. So that's pretty straightforward. And then when we go down here and we're looking for to try to solve for either the revenue or expenses, what we know is because they're not for profits, if they had an increase in equity and they had no external contributions, then the difference in equity from period 1 to period 2, the change in equity, is the result of retained earnings. Because they're not for profits, their retained earnings are going to equal their net income. And so, therefore, we know what their net income is. Then we can, because we know the net income, we can fairly easily solve for either revenue or expense as long as we have the other one. So pretty straightforward.